So Marvel Snap's newest cards have been officially revealed via the latest seasonal update video. That means we have the final stats and text for these cards presumably locked in. And a few of them have actually changed a bit since we initially looked at these when they were first data mined. So we're going to go through, talk about all these cards in the context of the current Marvel Snap world, and we're going to rate them all from 1 to 4 stars. So stick around for that at the end of the video. But for now, let's kick things off here with the Season Pass card itself, Iron Patriot. And this one is actually unchanged, which means, in my opinion, it still looks really good. Iron Patriot's a 2/3 on reveal at a random 4/5 or 6 cost card to your hand. So at a baseline, you're just generating something in hand. That alone might actually be valuable, particularly if you're playing a deck that leans into that. You know, we're going to see another card in this video, Victoria Hand, that's buffing stuff created in your hand. So, like, okay, there, I'm getting a buff already. You know, we've also got stuff like Devil Dinosaur, Collector, things that care about adding cards to your hand or having hand size. And then on top of that, this is where this card gets really spicy. If you're winning here after next turn, so often that will be, you know, after turn 3 if you're playing this on curve, you give that card -4 cost. And that is just like insane, right? Like that's really, really good because on average, you know, your 4 cost card is going to be about 6 power. Your 5 cost card might be about 7 or 8 power on average. And your 6 cost card, you know, presumably 10 plus average and some really good effects as well in the 6 cost pool. There are obviously low rolls and stuff that, you know, might have synergies or stat lines that are hard to work with, but on average, you're going to get a really solid base stat body, and the discount's going to be significant. That's basically a 4 cost for 0, a 5 cost for 1, or a 6 cost for 2. So, you know, you're talking about like 0 6s, 1 7s, maybe like 2 10s, for instance, with potential upside beyond that as well. So as soon as you hit this cost discount, man, you're getting some really high quality cards in hand. Even if the effect's not valuable, often just like the stat line. I mean, think about like a Spectrum or something. Even if you don't have a great way to use the Spectrum, it's still a 2/5, and maybe you catch a buff here or there with your, like, you know, Victoria Hand or whatever. But it's like, okay, a 2/5 is like the low roll scenario. Not great, but okay, sure. You know, maybe there's still a way to weave that in and make a play. And I think it's going to be pretty trivial, in fact, actually, to satisfy this condition. Because, you know, if you just like play this far right location or whatever on turn 2, pretty unlikely your opponent plays there. You often go into that turn 3 with a 3 power head start. And as long as you have anything to do on turn 3, it's going to be really tough for decks to actually match that power. So I think you're often going to be winning. Maybe if they have like a Gladiator or, you know, some kind of crazy Hydra Bob plus 2 drop line or something to counter this. But I think more often than not, this is going to connect. It's going to give you a really high quality card in hand that is, number one, super efficient from a cost and stat output standpoint, but also just really hard to predict. Like, you're going to have that informational advantage. So this is, you know, a little bit like maybe like Valentina, for instance, but just way more upside than Valentina potentially, because, you know, that 4 cost discount is significant and there's no debuff to the stats in this case either. So the conditionality here is like a trade-off, but not a significant trade-off, because I think it's actually going to be really easy to achieve. So what does that mean? What kind of decks run this? Well, honestly, I think any kind of like tempo deck that's just playing things out early and consistently could be great with this card. You know, I'm probably going to do it like in a Wiccan deck on day 1, because like Wiccan already has really reliable early game plays. It's going to be super easy to hit the curve necessary to support Iron Patriot, slam like a, you know, I don't know, speed or something on turn 3. That's usually going to be more than enough to satisfy the condition. You're going to be stacking a speed plus an Iron Patriot, and or whatever else, you know, 2-drop plus some 1-drops from Kate Bishop, who knows, whatever it is, you're going to have a ton of stat output potential. And then, you know, in a Wiccan deck in particular, like, you're going to have plenty of energy to swing in this bonus 6 cost card and have enough resources in hand to satisfy all that extra energy in hand. So it just feels like a perfect fit in that kind of deck. And anything else that's just like happily playing 3 drops consistently might make room for Iron Patriot. Does this even go in like a Silver Surfer deck? You know, like play Iron Patriot into your big 3-drop of choice. This is suddenly a little interesting way to curve in, because Silver Surfer sometimes has those weird gaps like on turn 5, and it's like, hey man, maybe I have a 2-cost 6-drop now to play on turn 5 to weave in with a 3-drop. Absolutely a possibility. So I think really a variety of decks could utilize this well. And then of course there are also the like specific utilizations comboing this with Victoria Hand, with Collector, with Devil Dinosaur, with Shield style decks, that might be, you know, its own archetype that's further supported by Iron Patriot and Victoria Hand here that becomes a meta viable deck. But I don't think you need that for this card. I think it has a ton of standalone potential. I think this is going to feel very, very good very often in a lot of decks. So moving on to Victoria Hand, certainly talked about this a lot already. She is a 2/3 ongoing. Your cards that were created in your hand have +2 power. There was a small, I think, like wording tweak to this. Functionality is the same since we initially saw this in the data mine, but I think they just tried to make it a little bit more clear. So this is basically cards that were created by being added to hand, not cards that were added to deck. For that clarification, so things like Arishem and Thanos, those are getting added to deck. This will not buff your Thanos or Arishem cards, but stuff like Shield cards, your Iron Patriot, etc., this is going to work great for those. So this is going to be kind of a power spike card for those Collector, Devil Dinosaur, Shield kind of decks where you're generating all of these things in hand. And I will say too, it's a pretty significant power boost as well. This is a 2/3 at a baseline. As soon as you have like 3 cards down, the net output on this card is going to have another +6, making it kind of a 2/9 effective, which does feel pretty good, right? And there are other cards too that can add a bunch of stuff to hand. Think about like Kate Bishop, for instance. That's 2 cards added to hand that are each 1 cost. And there's some other ways to add really low cost things to hand as well. So you could even maybe see those decks shift a little bit lower, trying to play more cards out as opposed to trying to play like bigger cards and supporting a Devil Dinosaur thing. So between Victoria Hand putting a ton of power out across multiple cards, with like Collector giving you another big boost in a single location, and then just the like consistent output of all the various things you're generating, those baseline stats, does feel like it adds up to quite a bit of power all condensed out of this Victoria Hand. And I will say, you know, this card does have a lot of power baked into it, so a little bit counterable. You know, single rogue or enchantress or whatever could be a big way to shut down Victoria Hand. That might be a lot of susceptibility. You know, that said, I would never expect this deck to be like, you know, the tier 1, you see it everywhere kind of deck. I think it would be like slightly off meta, tier 2, viable and competitive. And it wouldn't be something, in other words, I expect people to target often, right? So might catch a few strays here and there, but you might have other good ongoing targets in that deck, like a Devil Dinosaur, for instance, or just enough consistency that if your opponent's doing that sort of countering, maybe, you know, you just have enough baseline power to get around it and still make your deck functional. So I do think this is efficient enough from a power output standpoint that it gives this deck a big boost. I think the Shield stuff has always been, you know, like you can succeed with it. We've made videos on it here and there, and like it had some wins. It's never been a real meta relevant force, at least in recent eras. Collector certainly had his time in the past. But I think this is a significant enough push that it does become an actual meta deck off the back of Victoria Hand. This is just a lot of power output. If you think about this compared to something like Cerebro, right? Cerebro can drive decks all by himself. Victoria Hand is similar, but perhaps, you know, even more workable. Cerebro just has so much deck building restriction. This has a lot more openness and feels like this 1-2 punch of Iron Patriot into Victoria Hand is a lot for this archetype in particular. So I do actually have quite a bit of faith in this card making some waves in the meta. All right, so moving on to Moonstone. This is another card that might actually help out your Victoria Hand. This is now a 4/6. When we initially saw this, it was a 4/5, which is actually very significant. We'll talk about it in a minute. And this has the text ongoing, has the ongoing effects of your 1, 2, and 3 cost cards here. So anything at her location on your side is going to get doubled up here, basically. So Victoria Hand is an ongoing card. You play Victoria on 2, Moonstone on 4. Like, my God, you're pushing out a lot of power to all of your cards created in hand if you're able to play those out on board. Like, think about your, you know, grapple arrow from Kate Bishop now being a 1/7 on the back of Victoria Hand and Moonstone. Starting to get pretty spicy. When we look at other, you know, low cost ongoing cards, there aren't that many that are exciting. I mean, there are obviously a lot of low cost ongoing cards, but yeah, stuff like Mr. Fantastic was shown in the reveal video. It's like, yeah, okay, like Mr. Fantastic's okay, but it's not really the reason you're doing this. I think the more like build around stuff, like Patriot, Cerebro, those are a little more interesting to me. And then of course the kind of flyer that goes across any ongoing deck is Mystique. She is a 3 cost ongoing card. So basically with Mystique, you can take any ongoing effect and then duplicate it with Moonstone. So, you know, Mystique on an Iron Man And then a Moonstone gives you kind of another 4/6 Iron Man plus, whatever other ongoing card you might have. So Mystique adds some real intrigue here into the mix. And, I will say, especially as you get, multiple ongoing effects baked into your Moonstone, I think it pretty quickly makes it apparent that this is worth it from a 4-cost standpoint, particularly at 6 power. That's a good baseline stat on this. So, you don't have to push for too much to make this feel really worth it. And because this is an ongoing too, you can kind of like play this on 4, play an Iron Man on 5, and then play a Mystique on 6, right? And create these little opportunities there. It's not like this has to be sequenced in any way, which I think gives it a bit more flexibility. Now, notably, that 6 power versus 5 power does limit one use case I thought was really nice for this deck, which was Cerebro 5. I was really anticipating Cerebro 5 getting a big boost when this was at 5, because it gave you a way to really boost that Cerebro while still committing a nice body and a nice card that's going to get boosted on that Cerebro. That felt really relevant to me in that deck, because C5 is really been one of the most competitive Cerebro variants. I know 3 and 2 are the more popular, but 5 has actually teetered near meta success a few times. This felt like it could be that big boost. Dr. Doom, Moonstone, Cerebro is like a deck in and of itself right there. So this going to 6, although a buff in general might be a significant nerf if Cerebro was an outlet for this. I don't think C6 is nearly as possible or interesting for Moonstone. I mean, maybe we'll try it, I don't know, but it does seem a lot harder to work with than C5. That said, I still think Moonstone has a lot of potential, particularly because Mystique just makes this always interesting across so many different ongoing cards, and really at any cost, transferring whatever thing you want into a 3-cost card. I guess you could even like copy an Onslaught and do weird stuff there. I don't know, there's a lot of possibilities. But I think also just Patriot and Victoria Hand both become interesting for this right away. Just a way to juice those build around low cost ongoing cards, of which there are only a few. Because again, I don't think you care about like Punisher or Strong Guy or Speed. Like those are all fine. I mean, maybe Morbius you care about a little bit, but the problem with cards like Morbius, where the ongoing is about stat scaling, is you're kind of doubling down in a single spot. The cards where you're spreading the power elsewhere allows you to commit some power to support that, like Patriot, Cerebro, Victoria Hand, while still spreading the bonus you're netting elsewhere. Morbius, you're just stacking 1 billion power into a single location, which seems less interesting to me. So anyway, I still think a pretty intriguing card. This is one that might have a hard time carving out a spot for itself just because the curve commitment is so significant. But keep an eye on it, right? Keep it in your back pocket, because who knows what kind of ongoing card could come around in any stage, and then suddenly Moonstone's like, oh my god, this is just such a great enabler here. And it might still find a home in the meantime anyway. All right, so moving on to our next card here, it's Ares. This one's unchanged since we initially saw it. It is a 4/6 with, on reveal, compare the power of the top 3 cards of both decks. If your total is higher, plus 6 power. So this basically becomes a 4/12 if indeed you win this comparison. And 4/12, of course, is really big. We know 4/10s have proven to be really successful, particularly in the Surtur Scar era. We saw 4/10s succeed a ton, and this is even bigger. And I would argue perhaps a little bit easier to succeed with than many of the 4/10s. Like the conditionality on a lot of the 4/10s are sometimes hard to work around. Like often the decks have to be built in a way to kind of play around that, like Atuma, maybe you have to have an armor in your deck, for instance. Like Typhoid Mary can be weird because you can't necessarily play cards next to Typhoid Mary very easily, or Crossbones requiring priority. Dude whose name I can never remember, requiring a 1-drop. Why can't I ever remember that dude's name? Cull Obsidian. Dude, that card is such a blank to me always. I always want to say Corvus Glaive. It's like, it's always confusing, all of those guys. Anyway, Cull Obsidian, that one's sometimes tough to get down. This you just play, and it requires a little bit of, deck construction considerations probably, but also maybe not. If you're playing this in a sort of Scar Surtur package, you're probably just going to have a lot of that big 10 plus power stuff anyway. And most decks definitely run lower on average, with a lot of mid-cost and mid-power cards. That kind of 5, 6, 7 range is where we see a lot of things. So if you just have 1 or 2 10-power cards get caught in your Ares, you're very often going to win that comparison across from your opponent. There's also just like a lot of like 0-power stuff, and you wouldn't be running those in your deck. You'd be sure that you like have maybe a 3 or 4 to hit occasionally, and then it's like 10, 12 sort of thing. And you make sure that you're winning on average. So I do actually think this is a pretty easy plug and play card for any of those decks that have that big card density. Now, can you risk it in decks that are a little bit more middle of the road? If you do have a bunch of like 6s and 7s and maybe like a generic Wiccan deck that has, maybe an Eliath or a Magneto in there is a big splash, but a lot of other mid-sized stuff. I don't know, man. I think you'll probably have to vie for a more consistent output card because a 4/6 is just not exciting enough. And there's so many other 4/6s and 4/7s that have meaningful upsides when this one's only upside is really from a power standpoint. Also, the fact that this can buff something like a Surtur or, discount a Scar, you might need that bonus synergy to hook into to make sure this is worth it as well. Now, there is kind of a secondary bonus for this card. We saw in the reveal video for this, it does not show you the cards that you're getting. So you won't know that your top 3 cards or your opponent's top 3 cards. There's not like a pure informational asset here, but it does tell you the power numbers. So, you might see, okay, mine is like 23 and my opponent's is 9, for instance. If yours is 23, you might say, okay, I have a pretty good chance of or maybe a guaranteed chance of getting like a 10 power card by the time I hit turn 6, because I'm going to draw a card on 5 and I'm going to draw a card on 6. I know I had a 10, and a 3. For instance, if you can, break that apart from your deck structure or whatever. It's like, okay, I gain a little bit of information there. Also, I know my opponent isn't going to be drawing anything big. Now, with your opponent, that still doesn't account for what's in hand, so you can't like totally eliminate what's possible in their hand. But maybe, you're playing like a discard deck and they played a Lady Sif and they didn't hit Apocalypse. Then you play Ares and you see like, oh, they only have 7 total power on their top 3 cards. I know they're not going to be drawing Apocalypse in the next 3 turns. So there are these little scenarios occasionally where it might line up to give you a notable informational advantage. Other times it might be really hard to math out or, separate the various stat lines. It's like, oh, they got 12. Is that a 7, a 5, and a 0? Or is that 3 4s? And, just kind of hard to separate it out. But on occasion, it could offer at least a little bit of information about your own deck and your opponent's. I don't think that's going to be enough of a boost to really push this into play necessarily. I think it's going to be tough. So that said, this card leaves me in a weird spot, right? Like, I think this is one of the more effective kind of just 4-drop stat stick kind of cards where you're just like big body, go, and it works. But I do think your deck has to be built for it, and it does limit it in a lot of ways. Like, it becomes pretty niche, particularly because like Surtur Scar is not holding up very well right now since the various nerfs it caught over time, like Typhoid and I guess Eliath and Scar and Surtur. Like, everybody's getting nerfed a little bit. This is not enough, I don't think, to bring that back based on the data I just checked. Like Surtur Scar has fallen off a little bit too hard. I don't think this gives it an edge. So where does this suddenly live? Like, is there a deck just running enough big 6-drops that it hopes to catch one here and there? Maybe, but I do think it's rather limited in its scope. I think, there might be 1 or 2 decks that make this work and kind of force it. And particularly, the week it comes out, we'll probably find something cool to do with it. But I suspect this one could fall off a little bit until the resurrection of some kind of Surtur Scar style archetype. Then, maybe this is lying in wait down the road. I don't think like generic tempo decks hit this reliably enough to be excited about it. I think they have other ways to put out more trustworthy sort of power than this provides. So our final card of the video here is Bullseye. And this actually got a big change since we initially saw this pop up in the data mines. This was a 4/5 when we first looked at it, and I actually liked this card as a 4/5, and now I like it way more as a 3/3, although I will acknowledge the fact that this did get pretty significantly buffed since its initial iteration might have signaled that it was a little bit underpowered. Sometimes, in testing, they said, oh, the 4/5 is not good enough. It's clunky. They made it a 3/3. Notably, it's not a 3/4. They did remove, a couple points of power, so maybe it was like close to the edge, and maybe it was more of kind of a curve fit consideration than it was a like power conversation. Because I do remember talking about how this felt weird at 4 in discard decks. There's a lot of stuff you might like to do at 4 instead. But anyway, let's talk about Bullseye. It's a 3/3. Activate. Discard all cards that cost 1 or less from your hand. Afflict that many different enemy cards with -2 power. So basically, this is kind of a machine gun I think you try to launch at the end of the game with a handful of little stuff, which probably includes discard synergy stuff. I think Scorn is your number 1 target. You're just, happy to discard a Scorn. That's +2 for you, -2 for the opponent. That's already really nice swing on Bullseye. Like literally just Bullseye into Scorn is like going to make this a 3-7, right? That's -2 +2, 3 at a base, 7 power 3 drop already just on a Scorn. Then anything else is a bonus. So you have like Dakin and the Obsidian Shard. You can try to run a Dakin. That's another 1 cost shard in hand that gets discarded reliably. That's +4 on the Dakin, -2 on the opponent. That's another, 6-point output possible thanks to Bullseye. And, this is hitting all of those cards. So it's really reliable, unlike some other discard stuff. MODOK can also do this sort of thing, which we're going to talk about how this fits into discard a little bit more. But this allows you to, isolate those specifically as well. And then, of course, you have Swarms. If at any point you've discarded Swarm, you've got 0 cost Swarms in hand. This is another way to turn Swarms into negative power on your opponent's side. Now, the Swarm thing's a little bit sticky, right? Because Swarms are often 0/3s in hand. You might be better off just playing the Swarms than discarding them, unless, of course, you have something like Morbius as a consideration, or perhaps something like Collector as a consideration. So you need a way to net a little bit of extra bonus power per Swarm discard. Otherwise, the Swarms are just better off being played, board size, notwithstanding. So does Bullseye become a really neat little enabler in something like a Collector Morbius Bullseye discard deck that's kind of more like combo oriented, where you're trying to like set up this hand state of all this stuff, scale up a Morbius, scale up a Collector, and then blow it up with Bullseye and just kind of wipe out your opponent's side of the board all at once at the end. I think that's absolutely a possibility. So it shifts away from like normal Apocalypse Dracula discard stuff, which might not necessarily work quite as well for Bullseye. There is a world where Bullseye and Dracula kind of enable each other, but not well through Swarm and not well through Scorn. Confusing, those sound so similar, because those put the cards back in hand, which is bad for your Dracula. So the things that make Bullseye good aren't necessarily the things that make like Dracula and Apocalypse work well necessarily in a discard deck together. So I think you might see this shift in a different direction. I also wonder if there's a possibility here to weave in like an Ajax. Does Ajax become a high power card in this deck? Because notably Bullseye does say afflict that many different enemy cards with -2 power. So it sounds like it's not going to be choosing repeat targets in this case, which means each tick is also a nice little buff on your Ajax as well because of this affliction upside. So I don't know if Ajax gets in there. It seems like maybe you don't necessarily need that. You might just want to have more reliability. I'm almost thinking about stuff like Moon Girl as well. Do you just want to like Moon Girl and copy some Scorns and some other low cost stuff, even if it's just fodder in hand for Bullseye, who knows? There could be like an X23 and just get a hand of X23 and Scorn and Dakin Shard and Moon Girl it and go from there, right? There's a lot of different things you can do with this. So I kind of like this, man. I think this has a ton of power output potential. There are, of course, ways to answer this. There's stuff like Red Guardian. If you try to wait too long, you're putting in Red Guardian, your Bullseye. But you can probably play around that with good positioning and good game sense and stuff. So I'm intrigued to see this becoming a new combo enabler. And I really like it at 3 costs because it's just easier to weave in early, get it there. Then you have more time for your Moon Girl, for your Silver Samurai, for your whatever Dakin things. You've basically got this down early, got it out of the way. It's just sitting there waiting for that activate to hit later. Whereas at 4 costs, this I think felt a little clunkier to weave in time. So ultimately, I actually do see a lot of potential in this card because it just puts out numbers when you build for it. Will it be like super competitive? Will it be too combo-y, kind of like meme deck status? Maybe, but I don't know, dude. This is a weapon. Like this feels like it could do the work all on its own. All right, so all that said, let's go ahead and rate these cards from 1 to 4 stars, starting with the best and going to the worst. Iron Patriot is a 4-star card. Bullseye is a 3-star card. Victoria Hand is a 3-star card. Moonstone is a 3-star card. Ares is a 2-star card. And yeah, there you go. Remember, 3 stars is in the top half. Remember, it's a 4-point scale. At 3 stars does not mean it's like average. That means it's better than average. That means good. I think, like tier 2 decks and stuff will absolutely use this card. I think Iron Patriot, though, as a 4-star card, is potentially like a meta standout that we see a lot of and might even feel pretty frustrating to play against sometimes because it's like, oh great, what 2 cost 6 drop are they going to own me with today? I can't wait. I wonder if we'll see the meta like adapted to big 3-drops trying to beat this or something, you know, like gladiators everywhere to try to match up with the Iron Patriot, or you're playing your 1-drops in the right lane to try to get out ahead of it or something, or in the middle lane, whatever. So still some big potential here, I think. I'm excited actually to play all these cards. I think they're all pretty unique. Ares might be kind of the most boring. It's just a numbers card, but still pretty big numbers. And I think seeing, like, you know, the information it provides could be pretty fun to try to deduce as well throughout the course of the game, figure out what exactly they're working with. So all in all, kind of not my favorite characters this month necessarily. Like, I guess Victoria Hand is really boring to me. I don't know what Moonstone's about. Ares, I mean, I like medieval stuff, so that's pretty cool. Bullseye is at least a character I know and recognize, and Iron Patriot I recognize, so I guess not too bad. But anyway, share your thoughts on these cards down below. Stay tuned for some videos covering all these in the near future. Thanks always for watching, and I will see you around.